you now have your answer. So our next case study will focus on the topic of e-cigarettes. This session will be moderated by Professor Craig Ross, who's a research assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology at the Boston University School of Public Health. His research interests include substance use, particularly substance use initiation, social and familial determinants of substance abuse, and health concerns of vulnerable populations. Professor Ross has developed innovative research methods to examine the influence of media exposure on alcohol use and has been the primary scientific advisor to the Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth since its inception in 2002. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ross.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to talk about a product. Since Professor Fairchild was talking about red diapers, I feel it's okay to say we're talking about a product that's still in its infancy, still in its diapers. Electronic cigarettes have only been around for a scant decade. It's been remarkable as a public health professional to watch how quickly the camps divided about whether this is something that would be beneficial in reducing harm to consumers of tobacco smoking products, or whether this is a gateway product into tobacco use. I'd say the debate has not yet been settled, but hopefully we'll have more conversation about that. We have two fantastic speakers I'm very happy to introduce. The format today will be, I will introduce both speakers. They'll speak for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to try to hold you to that because I want to give everyone in the audience here a chance to ask their questions and engage in a dialogue, because this meeting really is about trying to have a conversation about how to make these public and private partnerships work. So if you start seeing me wave my hands, I'll ask our speakers to wrap up so we can move to the conversation. Our first speaker will be Dr. Derek Yach. I'm really delighted. Dr. Yach has really had a career where he has dealt with these public and private partnerships extensively. He's a global health expert and anti-smoking advocate for more than 30 years, and he's currently president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Throughout his career, he supported and led smoking cessation research and policy development, and has been a strong proponent of harm reduction policies, calling for a greater emphasis on harm reduction as early as 2005. He's a passionate advocate of health promotion and disease prevention, and in advancing his career's work at the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. He also has worked at the World Health Organization as a cabinet director and executive director for non-communicable diseases and mental health. He was deeply involved in the development of the world's treaty on tobacco control, known as the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. He's also the former chief health officer of the Vitality Group and director of global health at the Rockefeller Foundation. So Derek Yach will be our first speaker. Then we'll be hearing from Dr. Michael Siegel. Dr. Siegel is here at the Boston University School of Public Health in the Department of Community Health Sciences. Dr. Siegel is a physician. He completed his residency in preventive medicine at UC Berkeley and trained in epidemiology for 2 years at the CDC. His research interests are in tobacco control, alcohol use, and firearm violence. His tobacco work is focused on secondhand smoke health effects, exposure, and policies, cigarette advertising and marketing practices and their effects on youth, and evaluation of tobacco control policies and their impact on youth and adult smoking behavior. So please welcome Derek Yach as our first speaker.
Thanks, and Dean Galea, Mike, colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here. I have a tough task, I guess you know. Not for the obvious reason, but also for the fact that I'm not going to be talking predominantly about e-cigarettes, and I'm not really talking about partnerships. So let me jump straight in. I think from Amy, I learned a lot, as I usually do. I think the centrality of what she's saying is that all sources of funding bring biases and baggage. How we deal with them to do public good is the real challenge, and for us, the opportunity. I've always had one goal throughout my career, and as you can hear, I can't keep a job, namely to advance global health with a particular focus on prevention and health promotion. And that's got me into a lot of trouble. It's got me into trouble in the public sector, the private sector, the corporate sector, the foundation sector, because essentially people still don't get it that prevention and health promotion is a better deal than treatment and cure. Let me just give my conflict of interest list, which is extensive. I've explicitly aimed to go outside my comfort zone, where I believe the real change happens, rather than sticking in one place for a career and hoping that people will read the wonderful stuff one writes. But I've always gone out with one tool that got focused and developed initially in South Africa, and then I would say well honed at Johns Hopkins, namely epidemiology. The day we stop putting the epidemiology out front is the day we start running into bad policy. And I've seen it wherever I've been. So in apartheid South Africa, our task as epidemiologists was to highlight the impact of political violence at a time when it was not the popular thing to do, to highlight the discrepancies in social class and gender-based violence, as well as inequalities in life expectancy, when there was no support. And in the corporate sector in South Africa, a number of us worked with an asbestos company, believe it or not, who set a goal to get out of asbestos and into cellulose. And we thought from a public health point of view, the impact would be massive, which has proved to be. The company was a Swiss company. At WHO, you'd think it would be a lot easier. Actually, it wasn't initially. Non-communicable diseases and tobacco were relegated to nowhere on the priority list, hidden away in the bowels of the organization under rehabilitation, whereas communicable diseases were seen as the big shiny star that needed all the funding and resources. While I was at WHO, I had an unlikely friend and support in Novo Nordisk, a pharmaceutical company, who many people may be unaware of. Has supported through the Oxford Health Alliance over a decade the bringing together of people to put the spotlight on non-communicable diseases being the challenges of the future. And you can say, yes, well, what would be the benefit for them? Well, of course, they sell half the world's insulin, and there would be a benefit if there was a greater spotlight on the importance of diabetes. But there was generally a broader goal of the company, and anybody who knows how Danish companies works, to actually improve the long-term social goal. And that's what they did. When I was at PepsiCo, I was first heavily shunned by colleagues in public health for having gone partly to the dark side. I completed that transition, as our good friend Stan Glantz can confirm, with the foundation work. But what was I doing at PepsiCo, and why did I go? Well, it was a very simple one-on-one discussion with the CEO as her first recruit in Renui, when she said she wants to have people on board who've been as critical externally as she could possibly get to help drive change internally. And was that fun and tough? Of course, the outside people, many of you didn't like it. You weren't as tough as the people inside, the people in charge of marketing budgets who didn't want to change, didn't see any value in moving from full-calorie or trans-fat-laden stuff. But over time, we realized that the science that they had at their deployment inside PepsiCo to address salt, trans fats, sugar, was way beyond anything I was aware of in the public sector, and was something that, if deployed, could have an impact, given that they reach 2 billion people every day through their products and services around the world. I left there not having achieved all my goals, probably would give myself a 65% success rate, but knowing that PepsiCo was then, and is still on, a permanent long-term change to the structure of their portfolio, which would benefit public health. And we left in place a roadmap that was actually built on something we did at WHO, laying out the long-term nutrition goals for the organization. During that period, and during the time before I went to Vitality, which I won't make a comment on, I was very aware that there were others looking for change. AB InBev was one who I sat down and looked at. So how did I then get into this foundation? I think it actually started in 1999 when I was at WHO, leading the tobacco program, when I believed as a scientist that we needed to know what the industry knew about harm reduction. Because if they had something they could tell us, we would want to advance it in the Framework Convention. So I invited them in to the first and last meeting into the bowels of WHO for an open meeting where the scientists told us what could they do. At the time, it was probably a decade too early, but they hinted at what could come, and it always stuck at the back of my mind, at the back of many people's minds. A decade later, or a little bit more than a decade later, we started seeing the uptake of e-cigarettes. And that led me in another job to review what did we really see happening in the two fields of snus and e-cigarettes. And what shocked me was that we in public health had actually ignored the evidence for 3-4 decades of massive differences in cancer rates in Sweden, driven by snus, and the massive emergence of millions of people moving into e-cigarettes, of which I knew little at the time. Clearly, this was a harm reduction intervention par excellence that, if expanded globally, would have a massive impact on lowering the risk. It would be a fundamental change. I wrote a piece in the Spectator Health in the UK, a pretty obscure thing that is read by people in high positions, which got downloaded more than any other article and got me in front of the CEO, Philip Morris, when in a meeting and a series of meetings, which were uncomfortable, as you can imagine, he laid out his vision of actually ending the sale of combustible cigarettes, something that I thought was unthinkable, was unlikely, and was difficult to believe. I mention it because I didn't sit there and were asked, do you trust what is being said? I went out to go and see what is happening, and I saw factory closures happening as cigarette sales were declining in Japan and Korea, and hopefully will in the rest of the world as well. Massive declines, not like marginal declines. I started seeing that in other sectors of the industry, there was a push towards an acceleration of e-cigarettes, not in the tobacco companies per se, but in a myriad of startups. Initially Enjoy in this country, later of course Juul, but hundreds of others across the world were starting to respond to what consumers sought, which was reducing their personal risk, either quitting completely if they could, but certainly reducing their risk with products that would take the bad stuff out. And during the time period, we then saw the FDA for the first time acknowledging that it's not the nicotine that kills. Well, we always knew that, or some of us did. In fact, some of us don't know that. Most physicians in many parts of the world don't have a clue that it's actually not the nicotine that is killing. And so I then realized that if we're really serious, I would have to take up a challenge that I was being thrown down to do something about the opportunities, both of harm reduction and better science. And the discussion around a foundation got created. So the question before you is going to be then, how can you do that and ensure that you've got an independent structure that is truly independent? And I know Joanna doesn't like to hear it, but I'm thrilled to have her here because I was inspired by what she and Mitch Zeller wrote, spelling out an answer to the question, what should you do if you want to have an independent foundation funded by the tobacco industry? We took every one of those 8 criteria to one of the toughest lawyers and got them to encode it and enshrine it into our legal documents. And I know that that is not enough, so we've done more. We've committed to open science in ways I'll be happy to take up in discussion. We have a board which is truly independent. Unlike the ABM Foundation, there is no representation of industry in any way. In fact, the only requirement from industry is to produce an IRS report, as every 501c3 is required in this country. And we're willing to go much further. I think the independent advisory structure, the publication of our report, is one step. But ultimately, and I'll leave you with this thought, when we think back to the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation 100 years ago, right in the first years, the objection came from none other than Theodore Roosevelt, who believed that Standard Oil was not a company that he actually wanted to support and give a tax break to, because the inherent nature of their product and the impact they were having on society was so negative. There was a huge concern at the time. A few years later, after the creation of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, the London School of Hygiene, and many others, the utility of the money, the impact on having an enduring impact on global agriculture and global health has actually meant that we've dissipated a lot of the discussion. So what have I learned from that? I've learned from let's use the best we can in terms of ideas about independence. And I open to all of you to say, what more would you have us do? Second of all, let's make sure that the money is meeting real, perceived, documented needs. Yesterday, the Conference of the Parties opened again in Geneva, and I was interested to read the latest reports. Our funding is going exactly to where they're saying the weaknesses exist. Accelerating smoking cessation, addressing harm reduction, addressing many of the gender concerns that are rising, addressing the needs of vulnerable groups, and importantly, investing in science in developing countries where the current level of investment is pitiful. Something like 90, maybe 95%, if I was to be accurate, of all the R&D money going into true science in tobacco control is being deployed in this country alone, mainly for this country, with virtually none in the rest of the world. Our goal through the foundation is to correct that. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Yach. I'll turn it over now to Dr. Siegel, and we will again have plenty of time for questions so that you can follow up on what you've heard.
So I have to tell you first that so I have to tell you first that Derek and I have two important things in common that are quite unique, I think. The first is that we both share the same view on the value of electronic cigarettes. And the second is that we've both been told by Stan Glantz that we've gone to the dark side. The only difference is that in addition to going to the dark side, I was also told that I have completely lost it. So, Derek, you still have it. So what I want to do is, Dr. Ratson mentioned Sisyphus earlier, and so what I want to do is kind of take on a Sisyphean task, which is to try to actually define some criteria that we can use to make judgments as to whether it's acceptable for an academic institution or academic researcher to take money from a corporation or from a corporate foundation. And I think it's important to try to develop criteria because there are a lot of different situations that come up. Every situation is different. The context is different. And unless we have criteria that we can use, it makes it very difficult for an institution to make decisions about accepting the money or not. So first, what I'm going to do is to answer that, I'm going to first take the easy way out, which is to use what Justice Potter Stewart said about when trying to define pornography, and he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to give you an example of knowing it when we see it. And just to put this in historical context, so between 1954 and 1999, the tobacco industry funded a body called the Council for Tobacco Research. The Council for Tobacco Research gave money, research grants to institutions to research a variety of facts about smoking. The reality, though, was that the purpose of the Council for Tobacco Research was specifically to try to deny the link between smoking and disease. And in documents that have now become public, but weren't at the time, the Vice President of Research said, "It's been stated that the Council for Tobacco Research is a program to find out the truth about smoking and health. What is true to one is false to another. Let's face it, we are interested in evidence which we believe denies the allegation that cigarette smoking causes cancer." Okay, so that's incredibly clear. There's no question about it. This is just an absolute fraudulent activity. But what happens when you have a situation which is not so clear-cut? All right, let me start by telling you what I don't think are the criteria. And this may be just as important as what are the criteria, because these are the things that people tend to talk about when discussing the validity of accepting money. So the first is, the objectivity of the researchers. So you'll often hear people say, well, the researchers are objective. The people who are doing the research are objective. I would argue that has nothing to do with the acceptability, because if researchers aren't objective, then there's no research integrity in the first place. So objectivity of researchers is not a criteria for whether sponsorship is acceptable. It's a criteria for whether a researcher is ethical or not. The second is the independence of the researchers. Are the researchers free to publish and say whatever they want? Again, that's not a criteria for deciding whether sponsorship is acceptable. That's a criteria for deciding whether or not scientific fraud is taking place. That's scientific misconduct if someone else is controlling your research. The third is looking at the program itself, just looking at the program of research. And the reason I say that that's not a critical criteria is because what's actually important is not what's happening with the research, but what's happening outside the research. What is that company doing? Not what is it telling the public, but what is it telling its shareholders? And then finally, not what a foundation is doing, but what the parent company is doing. So the foundation, it's very possible, and I think in the case of both Derek's foundation and Scott's foundation, what the foundations are doing are fantastic work. But if what the corporation is doing is different and not consistent with that, then it may create a problem. So let me just give you a couple examples for each of the criterion, and we'll look at Philip Morris as an example. So the first criterion is the mission of the company consistent with the mission of the receiving organization, recipient organization? So if you look at Philip Morris and you look at their mission is clearly still to sell cigarettes. They sold 760 billion cigarettes last year, and they made $74 billion off of that. And in the report to stockholders that they gave just 2 days ago, what they said was that their goal is to maintain leadership of the global combustible cigarette industry. So on the one hand, yes, they're funding the foundation for a smoke-free world to try to promote reduced-risk products. But they're not telling that to their shareholders. What they're telling the shareholders is we are going to try to maintain leadership of the global combustible cigarette industry. The second criteria is what is the true purpose of the research or of the foundation? Is the true purpose, are they being honest about the true purpose? So is Philip Morris sincere when it says we want to create a smoke-free world? Well, the company is still spending $700 billion aggressively marketing its products, including Marlboro, throughout the world. The company is still denying responsibility for smoking causing disease in 57 different individual smoking cases and in 11 class action lawsuits. The company fought the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. They sued Australia when Australia instituted plain packaging. They sued Uruguay when Uruguay instituted tobacco control measures. They threatened to sue the UK. And as recently as earlier this year, the company intimidated researchers who had published evidence that the heat not burn product that the company makes has high levels of a number of toxic chemicals. The third criterion is not what the company is doing, but what they're not saying. And I think that what you need to look at is whether or not the funded researchers have the freedom to be able to say what they want and to dictate the agenda outside of what it looks like the agenda might be. So for example, Judge Kavanaugh is not the only one who wants you to think that unless you drink to the point of blacking out, alcohol is not a problem. I think that Anheuser-Busch also wants you to think that. And if you look at their marketing and if you look at the Smart Drinking Goals statements, what they're basically saying is it's okay to drink as long as you don't get blackout drunk. And what they're not telling the public is that alcohol is a carcinogen and that any level of exposure to a carcinogen increases your risk. So it's not just what the companies are saying, it's what they're not saying. So those are the three criteria that I would set out, and there's certainly room for subjectivity, and it's not. I think it helps not because it answers the question, but I think at least it gives us clear criterion that we can look at to try to make decisions about whether accepting this money is appropriate or not.
Well, thank you to both our speakers, and I just wanted to give our speakers a little warm-up while you are thinking of your questions, and I hope that you'll ask for a mic and engage. But Derek, you've heard Mike sort of describe these criteria. You've been dealing with working within these contexts for many years. What are your reflections on the criteria that Mike has outlined?
I think with adjustment, I don't have any difficulties with them. I think there are a couple of issues. One, just to think about a bit more. It's very difficult for us to be telling PMI or any tobacco company what to do. In fact, we can't. We have no means of doing it. But I think if you do read the speeches carefully, and you quoted shareholder stuff, just the last speech has been very clear that the company has committed itself to end combustibles. That's very clear. The analysts, all the major financial analysts, have said that is the way forward, not just for PMI, but for Japan Tobacco, BAT, Imperial, Altria. And their stock valuations are based upon the ending of combustibles as we know it. The big kid on the block, the Chinese, have yet to make a significant move. And remember, they are really big tobacco at 40% of global sales. Our response to that, which I hope people will take fairly seriously, is to say we've issued an RFP on our website saying that I agree that we need to be not just documenting, but we need to make sure there's fuller disclosure of all the adverse and negative effects that tobacco companies are carrying out, including the court cases, including the marketing to kids in many parts of the world, and alongside it, a financial analysis of whether they are seriously investing in R&D, capital expenditure, marketing, to demonstrate significant change. The RFP actually calls not for us to do it, but for outside groups, possibly audit, finance, whatever. In the same way as we now have a ranking of food and pharmaceutical companies based upon these kind of criteria, we actually believe that that is a way forward for analysts, asset managers, and ultimately companies to make a move. And just one side comment on that, in response to, I think, a very important point raised on the floor, was the whole question of corporate social responsibility. I've sat inside companies getting more and more concerned that corporate social responsibility has no inherent value to actually change the structure and direction of companies. What matters most are the core products where the profits are coming from, are those being seriously changed, and they're not going to happen overnight. And in my view, and it may be completely naive, but it's certainly my view, having sat inside these companies, the challenge we're facing in the tobacco sector is fundamentally easier than the challenge we're facing inside the food and the alcohol sector. Remember, there's one legacy product, a combusted cigarette. That's all we've got to change, and it hasn't changed for 100 years. You change that, and yes, you may be selling nicotine, which some people may not like, but you take the risk down by 95+%. But to do that, we're going to have to get our act together to actually put out a roadmap of how that could be a desirable way forward, of which the research, the investment, the science, the kind of advocacy that's going on is all going to help and contribute, I hope.
So, Dr. Siegel, I wanted to ask you, you train many public health professionals, and we have an organization and a public health professional working in a foundation with a mission to make an effort to improve the health of populations. And if you were advising a student if they were going to go enter into one of these organizations, how could they make a difference? Would you bring a student to an organization like this, and under what criteria would you put in front of them to say, this is a way you could move forward and utilize this money in a positive way?
Well, I think the critical thing is to try to push the corporation as much as you can, and I think that it's very important to differentiate the work that the company is doing versus the work that the foundation is doing, because in both of these situations, with Smart Drinking Goals and with the Anheuser-Busch Foundation, with Derek's foundation, the work that the foundation is doing is excellent, and they're doing outstanding work, and there's no criticism. I have no criticism of the actual work that they're doing. The problem is, how much leverage does the foundation have on the corporation? And there are limits to what the corporation will allow. And so if the foundation, for example, decided, well, we think that if we increase taxes by 300% in every country in the world, that's the way to reduce smoking, that would be effective, I doubt that the company would immediately start sending out its lobbyists to try to increase taxes everywhere. Or if they discovered that plain packaging was the way to go, or advertising bans, I doubt that Philip Morris would immediately say, okay, we're gonna stop our advertising. So it's those limits which are just inherent in the corporation that are the problem. So I think what the public health student or advocate or professional could do is just use that position to try to influence the company and try to get them little by little to change. And I think that obviously it's important that there be outside leverage from public health organizations and advocacy groups, but I think there can be leverage from inside as well, and that's the role that I think that they can play, trying to move the company forward.
So I wanted to give the people in the audience here a chance to engage and ask your questions. So right over here, yes.
Hi, I'm Michael Pratt. I work in the Tech Transfer Office at Boston University. Professor Siegel, thanks for your rules. How would you apply them earlier in the situation, perhaps before the scientific consensus? Go back to the early days of asbestos or smoking or whatnot, before people knew. If a company discovered there might be a problem and wanted to first investigate it and reach out to a university, before any of us knew that it was a public health problem, would your rules still apply? Because the first two really were about the company's mission and what they say to the shareholders, but they don't know if it's a problem yet. Some of us might be faced with that, doing research in the early stages of a perhaps public health crisis.
I think that the key thing is to look at, you have to make a judgment about the sincerity of, is the real interest here, is the true purpose in finding the answer to the question? Is that the true purpose? Or is the true purpose to serve some sort of corporate public relations purpose? And it may be difficult to answer that, but I think that's the key question that needs to be asked. And if you, at the end of the day, you decide that there is a sincere interest in actually answering that question, then I think that it may be appropriate.
Dr. Yach?
Can I just give two sort of slightly different comments and also respond to that last point? I mean, I think, what Mike's saying about having influence cannot be underestimated. I just joined PepsiCo, and what had just happened about a year before was somebody called Dean Ornish, who many of you in the nutrition field may know fairly well. Dean chaired the Blue Ribbon Advisory Board of PepsiCo with David Kessler at the time and some others. And he made a recommendation to the CEO, eye to eye. And I mention that because it's very different being in a public health setting where you're actually not looking to the board and the chair of the company. And he said, if you're serious, you've got to take action on one thing now. Take trans fats out of the food supply. This is well before the FDA made its ruling, well before. And their response was, well, if you're showing us this evidence on cardiovascular risk, we're going to do it. And they did it. And there was a multi-million-dollar hit over many years, and nobody knows why they actually did in the first place, because nobody was pushing them. But I mention it because there was a personal ability of a highly credible scientist speaking to a CEO. Let me just go on to the other point. Mike mentioned the Council on Tobacco Research and some of their dark and devious work, which has been well described. But there was another side to it that we don't talk about enough. And I was just thinking how in the UK, for 20 years, there was a program funded by the tobacco industry, which was a grant-making program to leading academics. And who were some of the grantees? It's all in the public domain. Richard Peter, Martin Jarvis, Jeffrey Rose, Michael Marmot. The Whitehall study that led us to socioeconomic determinants first got its money from the tobacco industry. Barker, the early childhood origins work, first got their funding from that. Martin Jarvis, seen as our leader in harm reduction, first got their money. And even Richard Peter, through many of his large cohort studies, will tell you he got money. He didn't hide it. I mention it because it's very easy to get into the view that every time money is given for research, and in the past, it's done with a very clever, enormous set of lawyers trying to manipulate and shape the direction of research. Anybody who knows those people I mentioned would know that not one of them would have been influenced adversely by anybody and wouldn't have taken the money if there was going to be that adverse influence. So you might ask, well, why did they fund it in the first place? And I know it sounds strange to believe. I often hear, and I was at PepsiCo, we used to fund stuff because we just wanted to know. We didn't know stuff. We wanted to know the epidemiology and X, Y, and Z. Others may very well then want to interpret it and find a dark reason, and often there are dark reasons, but not always.
Another question, Dean Galea.
Thank you both. That was really interesting. I was wondering if I can actually follow up a little bit on the question I asked to the previous panel about CSR. So it strikes me that there is a real difference between money that's coming from a corporation versus money that's coming from a foundation corporation sets up. So just for a thought exercise for a second, and Mike, I'd be curious about your thoughts, but then also Derek's. Let's assume that the foundation is genuinely safeguarded from the corporations. It's completely separate, and one has the sufficient legal blanketing to know it's safeguarded. Why does it matter what the corporation's intentions are in setting it up? If the corporation set up the foundation because it felt guilty or because, I don't know, somebody just felt like they could sleep better at night. I guess my question is, what does intention matter if there is, again, assuming the thought exercise is this complete independence, which of course then the question for Derek becomes to then sort of make the case that the Foundation for Smoke-Free World truly meets that thought exercise.
So I think that the reason why it matters is because the intention defines what the project is that you're doing, what the nature of what you're doing is. So if the intention of the money is to answer a genuine research question, then what you're doing is called research. But if the intention of the funding is to enhance the public relations of the company, then what you're doing is marketing. In the guise of research, you're not actually doing research. It's research in the guise, marketing in the guise of research. And the only thing that determines that is what the intention of the money was. That's the only way to know the answer to which you're doing. In other words, you can't just look at I guess what I'm proposing is that you can't just look in isolation at a piece of research and say, what is the purpose of that research? That's just what goes before that is critical to evaluate what the purpose is. Let me just give you a quick example. I could do a
quick example. We'll give Derek a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. I could do a study to look at, well, this is a real example. The tobacco industry funded tons of research looking at the genetic predisposition to lung cancer. And you could look at that research, and if you just looked in isolation, you would say, wow, that's great research. They're looking to see whether there are genes that are... But the real purpose of the research was to obscure the connection between smoking and lung cancer. So what I would argue is that if that research had been funded by some genetic corporation which was using stem cells to create genes, you could say, that's legitimate research. But because the very purpose of it was to obscure the connection, I would say that that's just marketing. And so I think the intent is critical.
Dr. Yach?
I would just say, I think what Sandra is asking is exactly what we think about every single day with our board and now with our scientific advisors. And the question I have to all of you is take a look at the website and tell us, where's the potential for mischief to be done by the tobacco industry? Given that we are explicitly going after cessation in ways that the public health sector has frankly neglected for 25 years, and you'll see some of this coming out. Deep neglect of the science and harm reduction, and this is one of our first products, which Mike can be the first reader of, which just came out today in Geneva. And the work that we're starting to do to advance the size of the vulnerabilities is not something being done. We're very aware, and being from Africa, I know that we are committed to succeeding in ending smoking, which means that farmers, particularly in Africa, are going to be under incredible pressure. So why are we starting to fund looking at alternative livelihoods? Because we are so convinced that we are going to be succeeding and bringing the rates down. Now, is that stuff PMI wants? I think the one thing PMI probably would want is to see whether these reduced risk products actually are going to pan out and be at the level of reduced risks that everybody else wants. Now, is that a conflict of interest with us? Or is it perhaps a confluence of interest? And I think there would be some cases where there may be a confluence.
So we have time for one last question, Dr. Caswell. And then I want to just let people know that both of our speakers will be available afterwards if you want to buttonhole them and ask them further questions.
Will be lunch.
I just wanted to really try and draw a distinction between the issue of whether the research itself and the nature of the research is the issue that we should be focused on, or this bigger picture of the stakeholder marketing aspect of the foundations. And I guess what follows from that is the question, why is the foundation called the Philip Morris Foundation? Why is the Alcohol Foundation called the AB InBev Foundation? If it's not all about stakeholder marketing, which allows these corporations to operate in the global and national environments, why not call it something else?
I love the question, Sally. It is absolutely not called the Philip Morris Foundation. It's called the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. It's been branded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and others as the Philip Morris Foundation to do exactly what you're saying. Whereas the AB InBev Foundation is the AB InBev Foundation.
Dr.
Sorry.
So I think Sally makes a really critical point, and I just want to show you with one final example how you can have a program that funds 600 legitimate research projects, but is purely a public relations activity whose purpose is to defraud the public. So if you look at the research being done and funded by the Alcohol Beverage Medical Research Foundation, you'll see a lot of very legitimate looking studies, probably about 600 of them. But among those 600 studies, there's one thing that you will not find. You will not find any study that's looking at the relationship between low dose drinking and cancer risk. And so what the foundation is, what the foundation is doing through that research is actually a very sinister attempt to manipulate the research agenda so that they can hide the connection between alcohol and cancer. And that's why it's possible to have a very sinister program whose purpose is nefarious, but at the same time to have 600 individual research projects done by very reputable people who are doing great work and are doing independent research with absolutely no influence whatsoever from industry.
So we'll continue this discussion, which is quite energetic, but I want to have us thank our speakers today for this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was fun.
Yes, thanks so much to our panelists. The next item on our agenda is going to provide a wonderful lead into our next session on nutrition. It's time for lunch. We'll be reconvening at a little past noon. Please enjoy.